You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Dr. Katherine Ramsland, author and all-around amazing person, here to talk to us about psychopaths. Katherine, thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here, as always.
And what a fun topic, really.
It's definitely an interesting and much more diverse topic than most people realize.
So what was the genesis for this article? What made you decide, you know what, I think we need to talk about the history of psychopaths today?
Okay. I do teach a whole segment of formerly did, my forensic psychology course on the whole notion of psychopaths. What's the history? How did the concept evolve? How do we understand it today? It's complicated. And so I write a lot of blogs. I have a blog at Psychology Today. I've been doing it for 10 years. And often we'll touch on psychopathy. But in this one, I was going to write about the 10 types of psychopath that a psychologist named Theodore Milan had generated that hardly anybody knows about because it just didn't catch on. It's not the fashion. And all of a sudden, it just evolved into a much bigger thing because you see all these articles making claims about psychopaths. If you drink black coffee, you're more likely to be a psychopath. Psychopaths prefer dark chocolate. Psychopaths, this and that. And they're all really poorly designed, supposed research pieces. They're sciencing, essentially making it seem like psychopath is a very unified concept and that most of them will choose business majors or whatever it is. And it's just not like that. Clinically, it's not like that at all. So when I want to talk about it, I do want to talk about what we know in the clinical community versus what's out there in popular culture. Because typically people will think a psychopath is a criminal and a serial killer. Most aren't serial killers or murderers or even criminals. And I think a lot of people don't get that because the name psychopath is thrown around so easily at anyone and everyone. And it's just really not that simple.
When most people think of the term psychopath, who do you think they're probably picturing? Because I have a very specific picture in my mind when I think of psychopaths. And I think you know who I'm talking about because you just wrote an article about him with Kevin Sullivan. But when I think about psychopaths, I think of Ted Bundy.
Most people are thinking fictional ones. They're thinking Hannibal Lecter. And yes, and Ted Bundy is the prototype serial killer psychopath, yeah.
Is the term abused, would you say, when people are tossing around fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter or real-life characters like Bundy? Is that kind of a one-dimensional way of looking at psychopaths?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word abuse, but certainly way oversimplified, superficial, and mistaken for the most part. First of all, not all serial killers, though the majority are, not all serial killers are psychopaths. And as I mentioned, not all psychopaths are criminals at all. It also gets mixed up with the concept of a sociopath or antisocial personality disorder or the dark triad, or it's a mess and it can be difficult. So clinicians will tend to go with what we know from the instrument that measures this. It's a personality disorder that manifests a high degree of 20 traits and behaviors that are on an instrument called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. Clinicians are going to stick pretty closely with that. That's not the only instrument that we use. But for example, there's none for sociopath. We have no diagnostic instrument. So I don't even use that word. It's an old-fashioned word in the 1940s and 50s. Again, also thrown out there easily to call somebody a name. But there isn't any diagnostic instrument for it. Antisocial personality disorder, the third of these concepts, does have the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, for that one. But in every part of this, interpretation of behavior and personality traits is up to the clinician. And you're certainly going to get people disagreeing over who is or isn't a psychopath. Always. You'll always have that, especially if they're on the border. So on this list, let me just finish that. On this list of the 20 traits and behaviors, each gets assigned a number in terms of how much the person manifests those things. So from 0 to 2. If you're not manipulative, you'll have a 0. But if you're highly manipulative, you'll have a 2. So of the 20 traits and behaviors, the highest score is 40. If you are between a 30 and 40, you're considered to be diagnosed as a psychopath.
Let's stay on the checklist for a minute because I find that really interesting. You'd mentioned manipulative already. What other behaviors and personality traits are going to be found on the psychopathy checklist? What else is it seeking to measure?
Okay, so there's some that are not well known. It was a Canadian checklist initially, so it was and it was developed by a prison psychologist, so it's within the Canadian correctional system. So something like what we would call they break their parole is one of the things.
Okay.
And that's not something people normally think about, but lack of remorse, that's probably the hallmark right there, what we call the primary psychopath or perhaps the born psychopath. Serial relationships, jumping from one to another, parasitic behavior, deception, narcissism, such things as that. So you would have, and that list is pretty easy to find. You just look up psychopathy checklist and you'll get all 20 of them.
And that was developed by Robert Hare, is that right?
Yeah, Robert Hare was a prison psychologist, and he had corresponded with a man named prison psychiatrist named Herbie Cleckley, who actually did evaluate Ted Bundy at one point. Cleckley was the first one to really crystallize the traits and behaviors. He had a list of 16, and he and Hare corresponded a bit, and then Hare and his colleagues took those traits and behaviors, added a few more based on their work in the prisons to come up with a standardized instrument. So it wasn't just left to clinical opinion. It was really, here's a standardized instrument. He does a lot of trainings so people know how to use it. It's not just a simple, take your list of 20, sit in a bar and think about your ex-spouse. It's not that easy.
Yeah, I found myself thinking a lot about ex-girlfriends when I was reviewing this list.
I think some people would wish it were that easy and maybe treat it as if it's that easy, but it's not. And a perfect example is the guy's book, John, what's his name, Ronson, I think, The Psychopath Test. He wrote a really silly, almost mocking book with a completely superficial understanding because he's not a clinician. He was allowed in. I don't know why Bob Hare did this. I would have recommended that he didn't do this, but he was allowed in to see some of the trainings and whatnot. And then he just made fun of it, and he completely misunderstood how it was used.
I had seen that actually the other day, just perusing around through Barnes & Noble as I want to do. And I did notice that, and I picked it up and I was like, no, I don't think this is going to be worth my time, actually, because it really did sound like he was taking it a little more lightly than it deserves to be. Okay, good. I'll check that one off the list of to-be-reads. I won't deal with that one.
No, it's not a pointless book.
How accurate would you say the PCLR actually is? I know it's determined by the clinician working with it, but how accurate would you say it is?
It actually depends on who you ask, because there's certainly controversy in the psychiatric community about whether it's really the best. There are other instruments, but it's certainly the most validated, and it is also proven to be one of the best instruments for predicting the potential for violent behavior. If you're already a violent person, a violent psychopath, the chances that if you get out of prison, you will repeat your crime, the chances are high. And the psychopathy checklist is one of the key predictors for that.
How long ago was that research done? So when you talk about a number of clinicians, thousands, using these materials, how long has that been around?
Cleckley wrote his book in the 1940s with multiple editions of it. Hare and his colleagues were working with this in the 1970s. I believe the initial testing was in late 70s, early 80s, 1980s. And so it has been around that long in terms of how much they've worked with it. The problem with it was that most of the research was done on incarcerated individuals. So some of the claims made for psychopaths had to do with, for example, impulsivity is one of the traits. This is what I talk about in my class. You might find high degree of impulsivity in people who have been caught and incarcerated. But let's say there's a lot of psychopaths who are more planful, more careful, more calculating, don't get caught. And that ends up not coming up on the psychopathy checklist because the checklist was based on these incarcerated individuals. So that's one of the criticisms of it is it's way too much skewed toward an incarcerated population and also toward males and also toward adults. So in maybe the last 20 years, we've done a lot more on other races, on juveniles, even young kids. There have been some iterations of the psychopathy checklist for kids, for women. And so there's more research now on other types of populations, but the majority of the early research was really on incarcerated male offenders who were adults.
Is psychopathy something that occurs more in men or women, or just like anything across the population, is it going to be maybe in equal measure? Or does it skew more toward men?
That's the problem, is it does skew toward men, but that in part, we have women diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, for example, who might actually be psychopaths instead.
Okay.
There was, for a while, a reluctance to diagnose females as psychopaths because it seemed more, because there's more violence among males. But that, again, is a misunderstanding of psychopathy, that it's about violence, because it isn't. Bob Hare says we have the same distribution of psychopathy in females as in males, but the females tend to have lower scores overall. Like male psychopaths might be up in the 37, 38, 39, women more toward 31, 32, 33. But he says the distribution is still fairly close. Others will say, again, it depends on the research and how it's being interpreted, but others will say there certainly are fewer female psychopaths than male. But are they being accurately diagnosed? That's a question. Because they do seem to manifest things in different ways. They're more manipulative, for example, rather than narcissistic, let's say. And also, you want to throw in one more complication. There's a difference between a primary and a secondary psychopath. So the primary psychopath appears to be the born psychopath, the one where we're actually finding a number of anomalies in the brain that set psychopaths apart from other people. And so some are set apart from other offenders, some are set apart from other violent offenders. It gets tricky. But the secondary psychopaths apparently seem to be more reactive. So the primary psychopaths are low emotionality, blunted emotionality, no remorse. What you typically think of as a psychopath, the thuggish, grumpy, I don't care about anybody but myself type of psychopath. Reactive. The secondary psychopath is more reactive and often will have had abuse in their background or neglect or starvation or something where they've developed psychopathy as a survival tactic. And so they're going to manifest that differently. They have a higher emotionality, for example. They will manifest it differently, but they'll still get a high score on the psychopathy checklist, but just in other dimensions than that emotional blunting, that calculated, cold kind of psychopath you typically think of. So that makes it harder because psychopathy is considered to have these two facets. The checklist gives us these two facets, and both of them have two factors. So it depends on what they're manifesting. Some are highly parasitic, and so they tend to take what other people have, or camp out on their couch for 3 months, eat all their food, take their money, but they're not doing other kinds of things. So the way we understand psychopaths, it has to do with the kind of behavior they're manifesting more often. And that's why it's just not a uniform concept. Different psychopaths will manifest different types of behaviors, but all of them would still, if they come up in that 30 to 40 range on the test, they're still going to be considered psychopaths, even though they act differently. I think that's very complicated, if you understand what I'm saying.
No, totally. And keeping in mind that I haven't had more than a rudimentary psychology class in a very long time. I took abnormal psych in college, and I think it's about the last time I touched it. I guess I had never given a lot of thought to the idea that psychopaths can be created. I always thought there was this idea that you are born with psychopathy. It hadn't occurred to me that it can be developed over time. So this is very interesting to me.
And also, some people will say, oh, when you say primary versus secondary psychopath, that's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. So you'll get that whole segment of the clinical community saying that as well. But certainly that secondary psychopathy is or appears to be more environmentally attuned and reactive than the primary psychopath, which appears, from what we know from brain research, to have been born with an emotional disconnect. So their emotionality, I saw a study recently about how they have a hard time with music. Their emotionality is considered fairly superficial. They're not deeply rooted in the truth because they're manipulators. They're going to do whatever it works to their own advantage, and they're not going to care who gets hurt in the process. Even their own family, they're not going to care because what matters is what they want. That's more the primary psychopath. You'll get some of that with the secondary, but the secondary is really almost more of a response to a difficult environment.
This almost sounds like nature versus nurture, doesn't it?
Except that there's no formula. There's none at all. Nature and nurture are part of both. How much is the brain a participant in this? We still don't know. We don't have enough. There's a lot of research going on, but there's nothing you could say definitively. If we could, the court system would have to change incredibly, significantly. Because if we go in and say psychopaths, let's say born psychopaths, primary psychopaths, can't help what they're doing because they don't process moral information or emotionality or caring. So we can't really hold them accountable for the decisions they make. That's going to be a very tough sell if that's what it comes to. Currently, we think psychopaths are just evil people who make bad decisions. That's the popular notion, but that is not what the research says.
That actually leads into a pretty interesting question here. What would you say are some of the most common misunderstandings that we have as a whole about psychopaths? And you really just iterated one of them, that all psychopaths are evil and have no sense of fellow feeling for other people. But yeah, what are some of the other common misunderstandings that we have about psychopathy?
That they all behave the same. That's what this blog was about, is how can you say somebody who prefers black coffee is more likely to be a psychopath? That doesn't even make any sense, that they all manifest the same, that they're all criminals is another one that you hear a lot. That just because someone's labeled a psychopath, they are a psychopath, because so many people label ignorantly. I'm often asked, they'll go through all the political figures, is so-and-so a psychopath? I can't actually, I don't know, because I didn't do the psychopathy checklist with them. We're not supposed to really diagnose people from a distance. We're not really having them in any kind of clinical arena, but lots of people do it anyway because there's enough behavior out there that's consistent across time to be able to. But the way they put it is, I can look at them through the psychopathic lens. I'm not diagnosing them. I'm forming a clinical opinion based on the behavior we do know. There's a whole book on, I won't name any names, but there's whole books on some of these political figures where you'll get psychiatrists and psychologists into the fray, all giving diagnosis of somebody they never met. And it's not that simple. So maybe that's the number one issue is people think because there's a checklist, it's a simple matter of going down the list, reading the media accounts and going down the list. It isn't simple.
Right.
It's not simple at all.
And they may have never even met this person.
Often have not met the person.
Those articles, when I read them, I'm not saying they're not interesting. They often are. But they usually start with some sort of caveat that you're not supposed to do this and you're not supposed to analyze someone that you've never...
I'm going to anyway.
Yes, but now I'm going to go right ahead. And then they proceed to apply some of these standards to these individuals and say, I think so-and-so is a psychopath or whatever.
Yeah.
Are there people, though, Katherine, that you've met or studied in your real life through the work that you've done over the years where you've said to yourself, this person is a serious and dangerous psychopath?
Interestingly, Dennis Rader and I have discussed this, the BTK serial killer, because he has never been diagnosed as a psychopath. However, the psychologist who came, actually many serial killers never have been, the psychologist who came to do the competency evaluation before what might have led into a trial, though he didn't have a trial, on the back of his report wrote in pencil, psychopath, with a big question mark. I don't know why he wrote that, except that in the United States, we don't tend to use the psychopathy checklist. We use the diagnostic and statistical manual, which isn't the same thing because that manual relies only on behavior, not personality traits. Maybe he was saying, I wonder if we should bring in the psychopathy checklist. I don't know, because he wasn't there to do an insanity evaluation. It was really competency. Is he competent to go to trial? So that was interesting. And Dennis has even asked me, do I think he's a psychopath? And certainly he's got many of the traits and behaviors, but married to one person, so no serial relationships. In fact, I think a whole group of psychologists took him on, and they found Ted Bundy to be somebody who gets a high score, but some of the others, not so much. And Dennis Rader did not rise to the level of a 30 on the psychopathy checklist, in part because he didn't have a juvenile record. He had never had a parole violation because he never had parole. He married one woman and stayed with that woman. And so there's a number of things he comes up 0 on this list. And if you can't get to a score of 30, he doesn't get that diagnosis. Nevertheless, I would say he's manipulative. He doesn't really have remorse about what he did to people. He may care about his family, but he doesn't care about what he did to his victims. He's not impulsive. He was very calculating, so there's a 0 on that part of the checklist. Certainly a diminished fear and guilt response on his part. Emotional blunting is there. But all of his traits and behaviors don't rise to the level of giving him a score of 30 or more on the psychopathy checklist. So people would say to me, that's just crazy. A serial killer is a psychopath. Not clinically speaking. And probably nobody's done more work with him than me. I've known him for 13 years now. We did a lot of testing and whatnot. And I would say he just doesn't manifest all the things you would expect of a psychopath.
When he asked you, Katherine, do you think I'm a psychopath? Did he really seem to want to understand more about himself and why he did all of these horrible things? I'm just curious why the question would have come up for him. Was he really interested in doing self-reflection, or was it just what do you think?
He's a narcissist.
Okay.
He's really interested in having attention aimed right at him.
Let's talk about me.
Yeah, and so we looked at a few books, and I remember, I love this one too. This has to do with, there's a whole aspect of the clinical community that thinks narcissists can do these self-assessments. And I won't name who gave me the test to give to Rader. It was a prominent psychologist in the field of psychopathy research. And he said, give Rader the self-assessment psychopathy test. I said, I think he's just going to lie. It's not to figure out what you're looking for on this test. And he did lie. For example, it was something like, has anyone ever said that you're a dishonest person? And he put no. And I said, did you not hear the victims' families in your sentencing hearing. He said, I'm talking about today.
Oh, it's manipulation 101, isn't it?
And and it invalidated his score right off the bat, because he was angling for, what does this mean? How do I make myself look good? Blah, blah, blah. So the idea of the self-analysis by psychopaths is so weird to me. And yet there's all kinds of research using that test with offenders who supposedly want to really know about themselves. There's such a thing as faking bad, there's such a thing as faking good. And we have personality tests that catch that, but that one doesn't catch it. And I had to give the test back to this psychologist and say, this just is not going to work. He's going to give the answer he thinks he should give, and not necessarily an honest one.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. The testing and the work that you did with Dennis Rader, was it face-to-face in most examples?
It was not, no, because in the prison where he is, it's a maximum security prison. I was in one booth, he was in another booth, and it was through a video thing. Some of them are pencil and paper tests, and he could just send them back to me. Some of them we did over the phone, but you don't get to be in face-to-face unless you're in there with his attorney, and at the time he doesn't have an attorney.
So you were in the same facility, but not in the same room.
And even now you can't visit him that way because they took all those rooms out during COVID and they haven't put them back.
Oh, wow.
Because now they have video. So I could do something like that on video, but I don't think I would get anything different.
Truth is, you could probably do something from across the country now with technology being... Do you feel like the reliability of the information that you received would be as good as if you were in adjoining rooms using a video system?
It depends on what tests you're giving them, what kinds of exercises you're asking them to do, what's at stake. So that's a hard question to answer generically.
You had mentioned before some of these evaluations are to determine whether someone's competent to stand trial and things like that. So they, in some cases, know that there's a lot riding on the outcome.
There's lots of malingering going on. If there's something big at stake and they have read books about how to fake it, they'll do that. If they are really worried, they will fake it. Yeah, and so many forensic psychologists are trained on instruments that detect malingering. Sometimes you'll find psychologists who are going naive, thinking they're really good at spotting lies. Turns out, research says, no, they're not. They're about the same as the average person. But if they believe they're good at it, they can easily be duped, and that happens.
Are there instances in which psychopathy might be a positive trait or can benefit a person who is identified as a psychopath?
You have whole books on that. There's the successful psychopath, almost a psychopath. Yeah, there's a number of books about psychopaths being evolutionarily superior. In fact, somebody recently asked me when I was at the Writers Police Academy, could psychopaths adaptively go past all the rest of us? And I said, when AI figures out a way to destroy the human race, the psychopaths will emerge as the victors.
Oh, great. Something to look forward to. The rise of the machines.
They definitely have adaptation traits, not for community and connection, but for survival. You better believe it.
I think of a number of CEOs, some of whom I've worked for. The
psychopaths are attracted to positions of power where money is handled, where interesting careers, because they're sensation seekers. They don't like boredom. They move into places where they can manipulate other people and get things for themselves and have power. That's why, and they're very attracted to politics, banking, CEO, so lots of business majors, definitely.
Investment banking, for sure.
Yeah, which is not to say a writer can't be a psychopath, because they certainly can be. Or at least half a psychopath.
Says the doctor with 70 books under her belt.
So it's actually entirely possible that most of us, at least once and probably more than once in our lives, have encountered someone who meets the criteria for psychopathy.
In about 1 in 100 people, the chances are pretty good that you've met somebody who's at least on the borderline. That if and they're not committing crimes necessarily, but they might break promises. They might might tell you they're going to do something, and then they undermine you with it. They triangulate. They set you up to be punished by somebody else, so you don't think it was them that did it. In relationships, they tend to be very narcissistic and cold, calculating. So they're not necessarily breaking any laws, but they're breaking hearts for sure. There's a lot of psychopathy survivor groups.
I can definitely see where that would be something that you would need or want to have around. And I'm really interested in what you said earlier about the fact that it's possible to detect it in children. Of course, as a teacher, I find that very interesting. I think by the time I get them as high schoolers, it's probably on its way to being developed. But I'm curious as to how young we could detect it. I'm thinking of that 6-year-old school shooter here.
Yeah.
From earlier this year. I'm wondering if that
had other issues, though, as far as I know from media reports. But 3 to 4 years old is when you start to see kids bullying for no reason, lying for no reason, stealing, doing property damage, showing these narcissistic trends, the lack of remorse. They start to show that kind of around 3 or 4. Which is not to say they're a lost cause. They're not. In fact, there are some programs now for, we don't call them psychopaths, we call them kids at risk of developing psychopathy. And there are programs now for early intervention that have shown that you can turn them around. And I don't mean in the Dexter way. In my opinion, I think that whole concept that he has to be concerned about, I don't feel things the way everybody else does. That's not a psychopath. They don't care about that. So it's about trying to show them why prosocial behavior is in their best interest. So you appeal to the narcissistic aspect to them to at least try to connect with other people and take care of them, even if you don't feel it deeply. It's tough, and especially if this is, in fact, an inborn thing. It's not like you can just change that easily. But yeah, we have programs and we have all kinds of early alert. Now, but I want to say this, because a lot of people think you can spot a psychopath, thanks in part to some of these articles. Here's how you spot a psychopath. You get things like they don't yawn when other people yawn.
Oh, geez.
This is absurd.
Or they use more flat words in their Twitter tweets, or
it's gotta be kidding.
This stuff is so dumb, but it gives people a false sense of security that they're going to be able to spot a psychopath if they see this and that. And you're lost if you like black coffee, dark chocolate, business majors, and don't yawn. You're in trouble. Because you're a write-off right there.
Unbelievable.
But the idea that you can spot a psychopath, that's exactly what leaves people open to getting into relationships with charming individuals that they think couldn't possibly be these con artists. And then they get hurt and wonder why.
Now we're back to my ex-girlfriends.
Back to one of my ex-boyfriends for sure.
I'm going to sound like Dennis Rader with this next question, Katherine. Am I making these people psychopaths, or did they make themselves psychopaths? I'm being serious here. All of us interact thousands of times with our fellow human beings. Are our behaviors impacting other people in a way that moves them closer to psychopathy?
If we're talking about the secondary form of psychopathy, yeah, because if they're already from a situation where they've been abused or severely neglected, and then you come in and maybe start up a relationship and then decide, this isn't for me. Whoa, suddenly there's that abandonment thing and horrible treatment by somebody. Yeah, so it could be. But often you'll get, with any personality disorder, you might get what we call comorbid. So other disorders too, which is what I wanted to say about the 6-year-old. I wouldn't in any way call him a kid at risk for being a psychopath because I don't know enough about him, but
sure.
He had enough of a disorder where parents were supposed to be with him. And that was a problem, that they neglected that particular duty. But usually psychopaths will have some other thing happening at the same time. So if you have schizophrenia with psychopathy, which we call a schizopath, whoa.
Oh, man.
But it can happen.
Yeah.
And they'll develop these maybe delusions and delusions with cold, callous, calculating, manipulative behavior that can lead to a lot of bad things too.
Okay, that idea of a schizopath is frightening to me. I just need to kind of take a minute and walk back from that one. Yeah.
It's rare, but it certainly can happen. Or psychopaths with delusional disorders, where they listen to enough conspiracy freaks and start getting afraid and going, I need to do something about this, and start getting armed. And then if you add in the layer, I don't care what happens to other people, now you have the makings of somebody who is more likely than not to be violent because they don't have that moral inhibition factor. We are finding that appears to be a brain part missing. It's just they're not making that connection with moral processing, because I think the narcissism sometimes is too strong. It's all about me. It's all about what I need for myself.
So you'd mentioned those early intervention strategies for young children who may be at risk for becoming psychopaths. Is there any way to treat psychopathy? And I know maybe treat is the wrong word. Is there any way to intervene with adults who are considered psychopaths, who maybe are looking at their behavior and going, I think I'd like to do a little bit better. Maybe I'd like to not be a psychopath for a while. Is there a way? Are there treatment options to treat psychopathy?
They're working on them. There's certainly a whole camp that says they're untreatable, in part because they don't care that much. And it's hard to inject care into them. What you have to do is, it's usually cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're convincing them that changing their behavior is in their best interest.
Right, but it's about
somebody else's.
It's about their best interest, and not what would be in the best interest of society as a whole.
Right. They don't care about that.
They don't care about all of us.
You have to appeal to what they care about. And if you think of narcissism as an arrested development, almost infantile, because it's very me-centered, really just doesn't extend beyond the boundary of their own egos, that would make sense that they haven't matured enough to connect with community and want to care for others. Not saying they don't care, because certainly I've seen where a really psychopathic individual still has concern for someone close to them. Let's say Israel Keyes was a good one. Israel Keyes, a serial killer from Alaska, wanted to not make the mistakes that Ted Bundy made, so he decided to kill people randomly, to go places, rob banks, bury little murder kits, and then go back a year or two later and pick someone at random. So that was his big game with himself. But when he was caught by making a mistake like Bundy, when he was caught, he said he would give up the names of his 8 other victims that they didn't know about if they would keep this out of the paper, because he worried about his daughter. So here is a guy doing this bizarre game where people's lives are taken so he can put notches in his belt, essentially, and yet he doesn't want his daughter to know he's doing this.
He cares about something, which is his daughter. Yeah.
Now, maybe it's because she's an extension of himself, so that's still maybe very egotistical.
Okay.
It's possible, we don't know, but I'm not going to say psychopaths care about nobody, because I find that there is often somebody that they might care about. But how deep does it go? Bob Hare would say they know the words, not the music. And in fact, we are finding psychopaths in studies seem to have a hard time with music.
Can you expand on that? You mentioned that earlier as someone...
I can't, because I didn't read the study.
Okay.
It was something I saw about not even a week ago and didn't have time to read the whole study. Because I wouldn't say, unless I could see how they picked the participants, because so many studies are not well designed, that I would want to see how did they actually get their participants, how did they interpret this, before I would want to say that, but it's out there. I think it's not hard to look up. So are the chocolate studies and coffee studies. And you almost have to have an education in research and statistics before you can know that these studies are poorly designed, because they do get into professional journals. They shouldn't be, but they do get in there. And I myself am constantly asked to evaluate studies and proposals. And I think, how did this even get past the first line of editors? It's so bad. So you have to always evaluate go past the headlines, which are clickbait, and find out, are we talking about 10 people? Or are we talking about 400 randomly chosen psychopaths? I don't know, but I'd have to see that before I could tell you much more about that study. I found it intriguing. You just didn't have time to read it.
I'll have to look for that. That sounds neat. First of all, the big question, are you going to be at CrimeCon this year in Orlando?
No.
Oh, Katherine.
No. I need a break from travel. I'm so sick of it.
I don't blame you.
Right now, the only travel I'm doing is for trainings. Had they asked me to come to speak, I probably would have, but they didn't. So I have other places to go to do. I'm doing trainings for a hospital facility. I'm doing trainings for police. That to me is more interesting and satisfying than just going to the crowds known as CrimeCon. So maybe they're going to invite me the next year, but this year is out.
And so then what projects are you working on now that as you mentioned at the top, you've stopped teaching undergrads? So what are your projects now? Like, how are you filling your time?
I'm actually writing a series of novels about a forensic psychologist who lives in the Outer Banks.
Yay.
or on the Outer Banks. And she runs a team. She owns a PI agency and runs a team. And I take actual twisty, weird crimes and put them into my fiction. So the second one, the first one came out last year. It's called Ice Cream Man. The second one's coming out. It's called In the Damage Path. And in a way, it's about what we're talking about, because there's a tornado in it, and the tornado's behavior is always understood in the wake of its damage path.
Ooh, I like that.
That's the metaphor of a serial killer. That's exactly how we understand a serial killer as well. So the metaphor of the tornado that happens in this particular book, which hits a prison.
Ow.
That book is coming out at the end of August. And I'm
excellent.
Working on another book that's similar to the Dennis Rader book, The Confession of a Serial Killer book, but it's too soon to say who it is.
Okay. Very interesting. We're intrigued. We will make sure that we put links to your Psychology Today article, Why It's So Hard to Predict Psychopathy, from May 22nd of this year, up in our show notes. And of course, we would love to have you back to talk about your book once it comes out.
I will say they changed the title of that blog.
Oh, did they?
Because originally it was called Psychopaths Take Cream in Their Coffee Too.
Okay.
And which was to say, some like it black, but not all of them. But they changed the title, unfortunately.
We'll make sure that we put a link up to that. I think that's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for joining us, Katherine. As always, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun to be here. Great questions.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.